Snow mixed with diesel exhaust tasted like pennies. Christmas Eve wasn't a holiday out here. It was an endurance test. Deep in an industrial alley behind a boarded-up liquor store, a rusted dumpster held a secret meant to freeze before sunrise. Two 5-year-old girls shoved into a damp cardboard box with 4 words scrawled in thick black marker. "Nobody wants you." They were supposed to quietly expire there under the freezing rain. Then a chopped Harley-Davidson tore through the silence. Exhaust fumes plumed into the frozen night, thick and white against the dim orange glow of a dying street lamp. Dutch pulled the clutch of his panhead chopper, his heavy leather boots dragging across the slush-covered asphalt until the bike ground to a halt behind a dilapidated strip mall. The engine ticked, a hot metallic sound cooling rapidly in the 10-degree air. Dutch didn't stop because he wanted to. He stopped because the primary belt was slipping, whining like a dying dog for the last 3 miles of Interstate 40. He killed the ignition. Silence slammed into him, heavy and absolute, save for the crunch of his boots as he swung off the saddle. He was 50 miles from the clubhouse, running on 3 hours of sleep, a gut full of stale gas station coffee and a deep, simmering irritation. Christmas Eve meant nothing to him. To the Hells Angels, tonight was just another Tuesday, maybe with slightly heavier law enforcement presence on the state lines. Dutch pulled off his thick right glove with his teeth, spitting a frozen piece of snow from his moustache. His hands were calloused, knuckle-scarred, smeared with old grease that never quite washed out. He knelt by the primary drive, cursing under his breath. The cold wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical weight. It made the steel of his tools feel like dry ice. He needed a wrench, but his saddlebag clasp was frozen shut. He stood up, kicking the leather bag with a heavy, steel-toed boot. That was when he heard it. A scrape, a sharp, hollow thud against metal. Dutch froze. His hand instinctively dropped to the heavy iron clipped inside his waistband. Out here, behind a shuttered liquor store bordered by chain-link fences and dead weeds, noise usually meant trouble. Junkies, scrap metal thieves, or wild dogs. He drew the weapon, the cold steel biting through his thin thermal undershirt, and stepped silently toward the line of commercial dumpsters stinking of sour yeast and rotting cardboard. Another sound, a whimper, high-pitched, ragged and wet. He lowered the barrel slightly. A dog, he figured. Someone tossed a stray. He almost turned back to the bike. He wasn't running an animal rescue, but something about the rhythm of the breathing, shallow, frantic, human-sounding, kept his boots moving forward. He reached the largest dumpster, its green paint peeling away to reveal jagged orange rust. The lid was propped open a few inches by a crushed plastic crate. Dutch grabbed the frozen edge of the plastic lid and heaved it back. The smell hit him first, a foul mixture of fermented beer, decaying vegetables, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh urine. He squinted into the gloom. Nestled between a pile of black garbage bags and a broken wooden pallet was an appliance box, damp, sagging, and collapsing in on itself from the sleet. Written across the top flap, in smeared thick industrial marker, were 3 words: "Nobody wants you." Dutch leaned in, his eyes adjusting to the dark. Inside the box, buried under a pile of shredded newspaper and an old grease-stained moving blanket, 2 small shapes huddled together. They weren't dogs, they were children. Dutch's breath caught in his throat, a rare physical reaction he usually reserved for near misses on the highway. He holstered his weapon, the click sounding loud in the alley. 2 little girls, identical from what he could tell, tangled together in a desperate attempt to share body heat. They couldn't have been older than 5. They wore thin, generic pink pajamas, saturated with freezing rain and filth. Neither had shoes. Their feet were tucked into the folds of the blanket, their toes turning a dangerous, mottled shade of blue. One of them opened her eyes. They were glassy, completely devoid of the panic you'd expect from a child staring up at a towering, heavily tattooed biker in a leather cut. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared at him with a horrifying, quiet acceptance, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together like small pebbles in a tin can. She raised a tiny, dirt-streaked hand and clutched the collar of her sister's pajama top, pulling her closer. Dutch didn't feel a sudden swell of heroic warmth. He felt a violent, nauseating spike of rage. It pooled in his gut, burning hot and acidic. He stared at the Sharpie scrawl on the box. "Nobody wants you." He looked back down at the girls. The smell of the dumpster mixed with the metallic scent of snow, creating an odor he knew he would never get out of his head. He stood there, the cold wind whipping his long, unwashed hair against his face, completely paralyzed by the sheer, ugly reality of what he was looking at. Dutch backed away from the dumpster. He wiped a hand over his face, feeling the grit of the highway on his skin. "Damn it," he hissed, the words lost to the wind. "Damn it, no." His brain immediately kicked into survival mode, running the brutal, cynical arithmetic of his life. He was a patched member of the world's most notorious motorcycle club. He had an unregistered .45 on his hip. He had 2 warrants out of Nevada that hadn't quite expired, and his saddlebag contained enough cash and contraband to put him in federal holding for a decade. He could not call the police. He could not sit here and wait for an ambulance. If the flashing lights found him standing over 2 abandoned kids in an alley, his life as he knew it was over. He paced a tight circle in the slush. Just ride away, his instinct screamed. Get on the panhead. Ignore the slipping belt. Ride hard to the clubhouse, grab a beer, and forget the alley. The city was full of garbage. This just happened to be the breathing kind. He walked back to the bike. He grabbed the frozen clasp of the saddlebag again, violently tearing it open to get to his tool roll. He grabbed the wrench. He told himself he was just going to fix the belt and ride off. It wasn't his problem. The world was a meat grinder, and these kids were just caught in the teeth. But the silence from the dumpster was deafening. He realized they had stopped whimpering. Dutch dropped the wrench. It clattered against the engine casing and fell into the snow. He swore violently, kicking the front tire of the Harley. He marched back to the dumpster, his heavy boots splashing through icy puddles. He leaned over the edge. The girl who had looked at him was now staring blankly at the metal wall of the bin, her eyes half closed. Her sister wasn't moving at all, her face buried against the other's chest. Hypothermia was moving past the shivering stage and into the lethal, sleepy stage. Dutch knew the signs. He'd seen guys freeze on runs through the Rockies. Once you stop shivering, your body is shutting off the lights. "Hey!" Dutch barked. His voice was a harsh, gravelly rasp. He wasn't used to speaking to children. He didn't know how to soften his tone. "Hey! Wake up!" The girl blinked slowly, turning her head with agonizing slowness. A thick line of mucus had frozen to her upper lip. Dutch reached into the dumpster. He grabbed the damp edges of the cardboard box and tore it open, the wet paper giving way easily. He reached in with his massive, tattooed hands. He expected them to pull away, to cry out, but they were dead weight. He grabbed them under their armpits and hauled them out of the garbage, lifting them over the rusted edge of the bin and setting them down on the frozen asphalt. They collapsed instantly, a tangle of frail limbs and wet cotton. The cold pavement was a death sentence, but he couldn't leave them in the trash. "Stand up," he commanded. realizing how stupid the order was as soon as it left his mouth. They couldn't stand. Their joints were locked in the cold. Dutch squatted down, the leather of his pants groaning. He reached out and touched the cheek of the girl who was awake. It was like touching a slab of refrigerated meat. No warmth at all. He felt a sudden, terrifying panic break through his cynical exterior. If they died right here, right in front of him, he knew the ghost of it would ride on his back until the day he died. He looked around the empty alley. Nobody was coming. There was no white knight, just a tired biker with a rap sheet. "All right," Dutch muttered, gritting his teeth. "All right, you little rats. You win." He unzipped his heavy outer leather jacket. He wore his cut, the leather vest bearing the Hells Angels' death's head, underneath, over a flannel shirt. He pulled the heavy outer jacket off. The sub-zero wind immediately bit through his flannel, raising goosebumps on his arms. He didn't care. He spread the massive, fleece-lined leather coat on the slushy ground. He grabbed the first girl, the one who was fading fast. She weighed nothing, maybe 30 pounds. He placed her on the right side of the coat. He grabbed the second girl, setting her right next to her sister. "Don't puke on my leather," he growled at them, a completely useless threat. He folded the massive jacket around them, creating a thick, insulated cocoon of cowhide and fleece. He zipped it up as far as he could, leaving only their dirty, shivering faces exposed at the collar. He scooped the bundle up. It was an awkward, heavy mass. He walked over to the Harley. The logistics of this were a nightmare. It was a hardtail chopper, no suspension, a tiny solo seat, no passenger pegs. He couldn't put them behind him. They would fall off and get crushed under an 18-wheeler. Dutch straddled the bike. He rested the heavy leather bundle on the gas tank, wedging it between his chest and the handlebars. He had to wrap his arms around the outside of the jacket to reach the grips. It was incredibly restrictive. He had terrible leverage on the steering, and the exhaust was radiating intense heat just inches from their dangling bare feet. "If you move," Dutch warned the lump of leather against his chest, "we all crash and die, understand?" A tiny pair of eyes blinked at him from the depths of the collar. Dutch kicked the starter. The engine roared to life, violently shaking the frame. The vibration transferred directly into the jacket. The girls flinched, burying their faces deeper into the fleece. Dutch slammed it into gear, ignoring the slipping belt, and peeled out of the alley, leaving the rusted dumpster and the wet cardboard box behind. The ride was a special kind of hell. The wind chill at 60 miles an hour pushed the ambient temperature down to 40 below zero. Without his outer jacket, Dutch felt the cold slicing through his flannel shirt like razor wire. His chest was somewhat protected by the bulky bundle of children pressed against his sternum. But his arms and back were going numb. His fingers inside the heavy riding gloves ached, then burned, then stopped feeling the clutch lever altogether. He kept his eyes locked on the white lines of the highway, fighting the crosswinds. The panhead shivered violently beneath them. Every pothole, every crack in the pavement transferred directly up through the rigid frame, jarring his spine and bouncing the girls against the hard steel of the gas tank. He tried to absorb the shock with his thighs, hovering slightly off the seat, but his legs were fatiguing fast. He kept looking down. He needed to make sure they were still breathing. The wind was whipping over the top of the windshield, creating a vacuum behind the handlebars, but it was still brutal. He saw a tiny hand reach out from the folds of the jacket and grip the leather edge of his cut. It was a desperate, unconscious grip. "Hold on!" Dutch roared over the deafening roar of the straight pipes. He didn't even know if they could hear him over the wind and engine noise. 30 minutes passed, the longest 30 minutes of Dutch's life. He was shivering uncontrollably now. his core temperature dropping. If he didn't get out of the wind soon, he was going to dump the bike. Finally, the industrial outskirts of the city gave way to a dense stretch of pine trees and chain-link fencing. Up ahead, slightly off the main county road, a neon sign buzzed weakly through the falling snow. The Rusty Nail. It was a front. Behind the dive bar sat a sprawling, heavily fortified cinder block compound, surrounded by concertina wire and high-resolution cameras. The local charters clubhouse. Dutch hit the turn signal, downshifting aggressively. The bike sputtered, protesting the sudden change in RPMs. He turned down the gravel driveway, the back tire fishtailing slightly in the frozen mud. He rode past the bar, directly up to the massive corrugated steel gate that blocked the compound entrance. He didn't have a free hand to punch in the gate code. He sat there, revving the engine loudly, shivering violently, honking the horn in 3 sharp blasts. A moment later, a heavy iron slot in the gate slid open. A pair of eyes peered out. It was Wyatt, the club's sergeant-at-arms. "Dutch!" Wyatt's voice crackled over the intercom, confused. "What the hell are you doing? Punch the code." "Open the damn gate, Wyatt," Dutch screamed, his voice cracking from the cold. "Now." The heavy steel gate groaned and began to roll back on its track. Dutch didn't wait for it to open fully. He gunned the throttle, scraping his left mirror against the steel as he squeezed through the gap. He rode straight into the courtyard, surrounded by parked Harleys and muscle cars covered in snow. He killed the engine right in front of the heavy, reinforced oak door of the main clubhouse. The sudden absence of the engine roar was deafening. Dutch was so stiff he could barely swing his leg over the saddle. He grabbed the bundle of leather off the gas tank, hugging it tightly against his chest, and kicked the kickstand down with his heel. He practically kicked the front door open. A wave of intense heat, stale cigarette smoke, and the smell of cheap draft beer hit him in the face. Heavy metal music blared from the jukebox in the corner. Around a massive custom-built pool table, 4 patched members were engaged in a high-stakes game of 9-ball. Reno, a mountain of a man with a beard down to his belt. Jackson, wiring something to a speaker in the corner, and a few hang-arounds fetching drinks. Dutch stepped inside, slamming the heavy oak door shut behind him with his boot. He stood there dripping melted snow and slush onto the hardwood floor. He looked absurd. He was missing his heavy jacket, shaking like a leaf, and clutching a massive, oddly shaped leather bundle to his chest, like a running back holding a football. Reno looked up from the pool table, pausing his shot. He eyed Dutch, then the bundle. "The hell is that, Dutch?" Reno grunted, taking a drag from a cigarette hanging out of the corner of his mouth. "You steal a ham?" Jackson stood up from the speaker wire, wiping his hands on a rag. "You look like you fell in a meat locker, brother. Where's your coat?" Dutch didn't say anything. He was too cold, too tired, and too wired on adrenaline. He walked over to the long leather couch near the industrial heater radiating off the far wall. The music from the jukebox was deafening. "Turn that garbage off," Dutch yelled. Jackson blinked, surprised by the tone, but walked over and yanked the plug from the wall. The sudden silence in the room was heavy. The only sound was the hum of the heater and the clacking of pool balls as Reno absent-mindedly tapped them together. Dutch gently placed the heavy leather bundle down on the center of the couch. The other bikers slowly approached, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. They formed a semicircle around the couch, staring down at the zipped-up jacket. "Dutch," Wyatt said, stepping out from the back hallway, his hand resting casually on his belt. "What kind of heat did you bring to my house?" Dutch took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he reached down. He grabbed the heavy brass zipper of the jacket. "I didn't bring heat," Dutch said, his voice dropping to a low, exhausted rasp. "I brought garbage." He pulled the zipper down. The leather parted. The three bikers froze. Reno's cigarette fell from his lips, landing on the toe of his boot, but he didn't move to brush it off. Jackson let out a low, slow whistle. Wyatt took a step back, crossing his arms, his jaw tightening. Laying on the dark leather of the couch, staring up at a ceiling covered in motorcycle parts and neon beer signs, were the two identical 5-year-old girls. Their pink pajamas were filthy, covered in dumpster slime and grease. Their faces were pale, their lips bruised purple from the cold. The girl who had been awake in the dumpster slowly sat up. She looked at Reno, at his massive beard and face covered in prison ink. She looked at Wyatt. Then she looked at Dutch. She didn't cry. She just pulled her sister's arm, trying to cover her with the flap of Dutch's jacket. Reno slowly looked at Dutch, his eyes wide. "Tell me you didn't steal these kids, Dutch. I found them," Dutch said, walking over to the bar and grabbing a bottle of whiskey, not bothering with a glass. He took a long, burning pull. "In a dumpster, behind the old liquor store on Route 9. "A dumpster?" Jackson repeated, staring at the tiny girls. "Yeah," Dutch said, wiping his mouth. He looked back at the couch. He suddenly realized how small they looked in this room, built for violence and vice. "In a box. Had nobody wants you written on it." Wyatt stared at the girls for a long, heavy moment. He ran a hand over his shaved head. He was the most pragmatic man in the room, the one who handled the club's legal liabilities. "Dutch," Wyatt said slowly. "We run guns. We run powder. We are currently under surveillance by the ATF. We are not a damn orphanage. You need to call the cops, now." Dutch leaned against the bar, the whiskey finally warming his blood. He looked at Wyatt, then at the two little girls huddled together on the couch. He remembered the smell of the dumpster. He remembered the cold asphalt. "I'm not calling the cops," Dutch said quietly. "You don't have a choice," Wyatt shot back, his voice rising. "This is kidnapping. If the state police trace them here, they'll tear this compound down to the foundation." "I said," Dutch repeated, stepping away from the bar, his hand instinctively dropping toward his waist. "I'm not calling the cops." Before Wyatt could respond, the smaller of the two girls, the one who hadn't moved since the alley, let out a sharp, ragged cough. It sounded like tearing paper. She curled into a tight ball, her entire body shaking violently as a wave of harsh, rattling coughs took over her tiny frame. She coughed so hard, a speck of blood appeared on her pale lip. Reno, the giant, heavily tattooed enforcer of the club, immediately dropped his pool cue. It clattered loudly against the floor. He didn't look at Wyatt and he didn't look at Dutch. He walked straight past them, straight toward the back hallway. "Where are you going?" Wyatt snapped. "To get the heavy blankets from the bunk room," Reno grunted over his shoulder, not breaking stride. "And someone tell the hangaround to heat up some soup. Now." Wyatt stared at Reno's back, then turned his gaze back to Dutch. The tension in the room was palpable, a violent clash between the brutal reality of their lifestyle and the fragile, undeniable innocence sitting on their couch. Dutch stood his ground, meeting Wyatt's stare. He wasn't a good man. He knew that. But as he watched the little girl pull the heavy leather of his jacket tighter around her shivering sister, he realized something that terrified him more than federal prison. He didn't care what happened to him anymore. He was going to keep them alive. Fluorescent overhead tubes violently flickered to life, drowning out the dim neon signs and casting a harsh, sterile glare over the scuffed hardwood floor. Wyatt had thrown the main breaker switch. Stripped of its shadowy, intimidating atmosphere, the clubhouse suddenly looked exactly like what it was, a dirty cinder-block bunker smelling of stale beer, wet leather, and cheap pine cleaner. Calvin pushed through the swinging doors of the back hallway, carrying a heavy olive-drab tackle box. He wasn't a pediatrician. He was a former Navy corpsman who got court-martialed in the late 90s for stealing pharmaceuticals, and he currently served as the club's unofficial trauma surgeon for gunshot wounds that couldn't risk a police report. He dropped the metal box onto the felt of the custom pool table, shoving the cue ball out of the way with a heavy thud. Dutch didn't move from his spot near the couch. He watched Calvin pop the rusted latches of the tackle box. The sharp, medicinal sting of iodine and rubbing alcohol immediately pierced through the room's heavy air, battling the lingering scent of exhaust fumes clinging to Dutch's clothes. "Get them out of that wet garbage," Calvin ordered, not looking up as he dug through rolls of gauze and expired foil blister packs. "They need dry heat. Skin to skin is best, but heavy wool will do. Reno, crank that industrial heater until the paint peels." Dutch looked down at the two girls. The smaller one, the one who coughed blood onto her chin, was shivering so hard her teeth were audibly clicking. The other sister had her thin, dirt-caked arms wrapped fiercely around her sibling's neck, her eyes wide, tracking every movement the massive men made. Dutch knelt beside the couch. His knees popped loudly in the quiet room. He reached out to unzip the saturated, filthy pink pajama top of the coughing girl. The awake sister reacted instantly. She didn't scream. She lunged. She clamped her tiny teeth down hard into the webbing of Dutch's hand, right between his thumb and index finger. It wasn't a nip. It was a desperate, feral bite meant to draw blood. Dutch flinched, a sharp curse escaping his lips, but he didn't pull back. If he yanked his hand away, he'd rip her teeth out. He let her bite him, the sharp pain grounding him, burning through the exhaustion in his brain. "Hey," Dutch rasped, his voice low, rough as sandpaper. "Hey, look at me." She kept her jaw locked, her breathing ragged through her nose, her glassy eyes darting up to his. She tasted grease, old sweat, and copper. "I'm not hurting her," Dutch said, holding his hand perfectly still. He didn't try to soften his face or put on a fake smile. He just stared back at her with absolute, flat sincerity. "She's sick. Her clothes are frozen. If we don't take them off, she dies. You want her to die?" The bluntness of the question hung in the air. Wyatt shifted uncomfortably by the bar. Reno stopped messing with the heater dials. Dutch didn't care about child psychology. He dealt in absolute realities. The little girl stared at him for a long, agonizing 10 seconds. Slowly, the tension in her jaw released. She let go of his hand, leaving a deep, crescent-shaped indentation on his skin that was quickly turning purple. She didn't apologize. She just scooted back an inch, keeping her hands firmly on her sister's shoulders. "Tough little rat," Dutch muttered, wiping his saliva-slick hand on his jeans. He moved slower this time. He peeled the wet, freezing cotton away from their bodies. They were painfully thin. Dutch could count their ribs through their pale, goosebump-covered skin. Dark, yellowish bruises mottled their upper arms and thighs, fingerprint-shaped marks that told a story Dutch didn't need to hear to understand. A fresh wave of acidic anger boiled in his gut, tasting like battery acid in the back of his throat. Reno returned from the bunk room carrying 3 heavy, dark, grey wool blankets. He dropped them on the couch. Dutch wrapped the girls tightly, creating 2 separate cocoons, leaving only their faces and the tops of their tangled, matted hair exposed. Calvin stepped over, wiping his hands with an alcohol swab. He pressed a digital thermometer against the sick girl's forehead. It beeped almost instantly. 103, Calvin grunted, his brow furrowing. He pulled a small pen light from his shirt pocket and shined it into her mouth. She coughed, a wet, rattling sound deep in her chest. Hypothermia mixed with what sounds like early-stage pneumonia. Her lungs are filling up. The cold compressed her airways, but the infection is cooking her from the inside out. "Can you fix it?" Dutch asked, his voice tight. "I can pump her full of broad-spectrum antibiotics," Calvan said, digging into his box and pulling out a small amber bottle of pills. "Amoxicillin. Stole it from a veterinary supply truck a month ago. It's exactly the same as the human grade, just a higher dosage. I need to crush it." He used the handle of his heavy pocket knife to grind the white pill into a fine powder against a coaster. "We need to get this into her, and she needs fluids, warm, clear fluids. If her fever hits 104, she starts seizing. If she seizes out here—" Calvin trailed off, looking at Wyatt. "If she seizes, we take her to a fire station and leave her on the bumper of a truck," Wyatt said, his voice hard, pragmatic. "I mean it, Dutch. I'm letting you play savior for the night, but I won't let you drag 30 men down on a murder charge if a kid dies on our couch." Dutch didn't look at Wyatt. He grabbed a shot glass from the bar, filled it with a splash of tap water, and dumped Calvin's crushed powder into it. He swirled the milky, bitter-smelling liquid. "Hold her head up," Dutch told the awake sister. The girl hesitated, then awkwardly shimmied her arms out of her blanket to prop her sister's head up from the leather cushion. Dutch brought the shot glass to the sick girl's chapped lips. "Drink," he ordered. She weakly turned her head away, whining as the bitter smell hit her nose. "I don't care if it tastes like battery acid," Dutch growled, pinching her cheeks slightly to force her mouth open. He poured the liquid in. She gagged, coughing violently, spraying half the white liquid onto Dutch's flannel shirt. He didn't flinch. He just held her jaw shut until she reflexively swallowed. She went limp immediately after, her breathing hitched and shallow. Dutch sat back on his heels, his knees aching from the hard floor. He looked at the white stain on his chest, then up at the ceiling. The clubhouse was silent again, save for the tick of the heater and the ragged breathing of the child. It was a waiting game now, a brutal, agonizing coin toss between the antibiotics and the cold. Hours bled into one another. The digital clock above the bar flashed 4:15 a.m. The temperature outside had plummeted to the negative teens, the wind howling against the corrugated steel of the compound walls like a dying animal. Inside, the heavy industrial heater had turned the main room into a dry, stifling sauna. The sick girl's breathing had leveled out. It was still wet, still labored, but the frantic rattling had subsided. The amoxicillin had kicked in, battling the infection in her tiny chest. She was deeply asleep, her pale face flushed with a less dangerous, manageable heat. Dutch sat in a heavy leather armchair pulled directly in front of the couch. He hadn't slept. He hadn't taken off his boots. He sat hunched over, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the 2 lumps of wool on the sofa. He held a mug of black coffee in his hands, completely cold, the oily surface reflecting the harsh overhead lights. A heavy scent wafted through the room, cutting through the smells of iodine and sweat. It was the distinctly artificial, comforting smell of cheap canned soup. Reno walked out from the small kitchenette area behind the bar. The giant enforcer looked utterly ridiculous. He stood 6'4", weighed nearly 300 pounds, and had a swastika tattooed on his neck, a remnant of a prison stint he'd done in his 20s. In his massive, calloused hands, he delicately carried 2 chipped ceramic mugs. He walked over to the couch, his heavy boots making surprisingly little noise. "Chicken noodle," Reno grunted, looking at Dutch. "Use the hot plate. Boiled the hell out of it so it ain't chunky." They don't got teeth for chunky. They're 5, Reno, not 80, Dutch said, his voice flat. Whatever, Reno muttered, embarrassed. He set the mugs down on the low wooden coffee table. Steam rose from the yellow broth in thick ribbons. The awake sister had her eyes closed, but at the sound of the mugs hitting the wood, they snapped open. She sat up slowly, the heavy wool blanket falling away from her shoulders. She looked at the mugs. Her stomach let out a loud, hollow rumble that sounded violently painful. She looked up at Reno, then at Dutch. She didn't reach for the food. Dutch set his cold coffee on the floor. He leaned forward. He knew the look in her eyes. It was the look of a stray dog staring at a piece of meat in a trap. She expected a trick. She expected the mug to be pulled away at the last second, or to be hit the moment she reached for it. Whoever had shoved them in that box hadn't just abandoned them. They had conditioned them. "Eat," Dutch said, nodding to the table. She didn't move. She stared at the steam. Dutch let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. He leaned forward, ignoring the throbbing pain in his lower back. He grabbed one of the mugs. The ceramic was blisteringly hot. He grabbed a plastic spoon Reno had dropped on the table, scooped up a spoonful of the salty yellow broth, and brought it to his own mouth. He swallowed it loudly, making a show of wiping his moustache. "Ain't poison," Dutch said, setting the mug back down, pushing it an inch closer to her. "Eat it before the fat congeals. Tastes like garbage when it's cold." Slowly, agonizingly, a tiny hand reached out from the wool blanket. She grabbed the handle of the mug. Her fingers were trembling so badly the broth sloshed over the rim, burning her knuckles. She didn't make a sound. She just brought the mug to her face, closed her eyes, and drank. She didn't use the spoon. She drank the hot soup like a dying man at an oasis, swallowing in loud, desperate gulps. "Slow down, kid," Reno stepped forward, his massive hand hovering instinctively. "You're going to puke it right back up." She flinched violently at the sound of his voice, shrinking back against the leather cushions, clutching the half-empty mug tightly to her chest. Soup spilled down her chin, staining the collar of the cut-down thermal shirt Reno had dressed her in. Reno froze, holding his hands up defensively, a look of profound discomfort crossing his scarred face. All right, keep your hair on, just saying." He backed away quickly, retreating to the safety of the bar. Dutch watched her. She finished the mug, licking the rim to get the last drop of salty moisture. She set it down on the table, her breathing heavy. The heat from the soup brought a faint, ghostly flush to her pale cheeks. She looked over at her sleeping sister, then back at Dutch. She pointed a tiny, dirty finger at the second mug sitting on the table. "That's for your sister," Dutch said, "when she wakes up." The girl shook her head. She pointed at the mug again, then pointed to her own chest. Her eyes were fiercely defiant. Dutch raised an eyebrow. "You want both? You're 30 pounds soaking wet. You'll burst." She didn't back down. She kept pointing. Dutch stared at her, analyzing the situation. It wasn't gluttony. It was hoarding. She didn't know when the next meal was coming. She wanted to secure the calories while they were available. "No," Dutch said firmly. "I said it's for her." She glared at him. Then, with a speed that startled him, she lunged off the couch, grabbing the second mug with both hands. Dutch reacted faster. His hand shot out, clamping down on her small wrists, just as she lifted the ceramic off the wood. He didn't squeeze hard, but his grip was absolute, an unmovable vice of bone and calloused skin. She struggled, kicking her bare feet against his shins, letting out a sharp, frustrated hiss through her teeth. Dutch didn't blink. He just held her there, letting her expend her frantic energy against his grip. "I said," Dutch repeated, his voice low, a deep rumble vibrating in his chest. "It's for her. You ate. Now you wait." She stopped kicking. She looked at his hands wrapped around her wrists. Then she looked up into his face. For the first time since he had pulled her from the rusted dumpster, he saw a crack in her flat, glassy expression. Her lower lip trembled. She wasn't used to a firm boundary that didn't end in a backhand. She was waiting for the violence. Dutch slowly released her wrists. He picked up the second mug and moved it to the far edge of the table, out of her reach. "Go to sleep," Dutch said, pointing back to the couch. "Nobody is taking your food. Nobody is throwing you back in the trash. Just go to sleep." She stood there for a moment, her chest heaving under the oversized thermal shirt. Then she turned around, crawled back onto the couch, and wedged herself under the heavy wool blanket next to her sister. She didn't close her eyes. She lay there, staring at Dutch from the shadows, watching his every move. Dutch leaned back in his armchair, picking up his cold coffee. He took a sip. It tasted like ash. He looked around the clubhouse, at the pool table doubling as a triage center, at Reno aggressively scrubbing a pot in the kitchenette, at Wyatt standing by the window, staring out into the dark, scanning the perimeter for ghosts. Dutch closed his eyes, the exhaustion finally pulling at his bones. He had brought 2 ghosts into a house of outlaws, and as he listened to the ticking heater and the quiet, synchronized breathing of the girls, he realized the hardest part wasn't pulling them from the cold. The hardest part was going to be figuring out what the hell to do with them when the sun came up. Grey, anemic light filtered through the frosted wire mesh windows near the ceiling, casting long, bruised shadows across the hardwood floor. Morning in the clubhouse tasted like stale coffee grounds and copper. Dutch hadn't slept a single minute. His neck throbbed. Every joint in his 40-year-old body felt like it was packed with crushed glass. On the leather couch, a small shift in the wool blankets broke the heavy silence. The sick girl's breathing had changed. The wet, rattling struggle was gone, replaced by a shallow, even rhythm. She let out a soft groan, her tiny, pale hand pushing weakly against the heavy grey wool. Her eyelids fluttered, parting to reveal bloodshot, terrified eyes. Instantly her sister was moving. The awake one, the biter, scrambled over the cushions, wrapping her arms around the sick girl's neck, pressing their foreheads together. She whispered something frantic and low, a secret language built in the dark spaces of whatever hell they had survived. Dutch slowly pushed himself up from the armchair. His knees cracked like a gunshot in the quiet room. Both girls flinched, snapping their gazes toward him. They looked like cornered wildlife. "Fever broke," Dutch rasped, his voice sounding like 2 rocks grinding together. He rubbed a heavy hand over his grease-smeared face. "She needs water." Before he could take a step toward the kitchenette, a heavy pair of boots clattered down the wooden stairs from the upper loft. Wyatt. He wore a fresh flannel and a heavy scowl, holding a cheap plastic prepaid cell phone in his right hand. "Merry Christmas," Wyatt said flatly, tossing the burner phone onto the coffee table next to the empty soup mugs. It skittered and hit the wood with a hollow plastic clatter. "Dial 911. Tell them you saw a couple of abandoned kids at the gas station on Route 9. We load them in Reno's truck, drop them behind the pumps, and drive away before the sirens get close." Dutch stared at the black plastic phone. He didn't pick it up. "I'm not leaving them behind a gas station, Wyatt," Dutch said, the exhaustion pulling at the corners of his mouth. "It's 5 degrees outside. She just broke 103 fever. The shock alone will kill her before the ambulance arrives." Wyatt took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating hiss. "Then we drop them at a firehouse door. I don't care. but they are not staying here. This isn't a debate, Dutch. You brought them in to thaw out. They're thawed. Now they bounce. Dutch looked from Wyatt to the couch. The awake sister was watching them intensely. She didn't understand the words, not all of them, but she understood the tone. She understood that she was a problem. She slowly reached down, grabbing the hem of her sister's oversized thermal shirt, pulling it tighter. Her jaw set into a hard, rigid line. She expected to be thrown away again. No. The word left Dutch's mouth before his brain fully processed the weight of it. Wyatt froze. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Dutch repeated, stepping over the coffee table, putting his massive frame between Wyatt and the couch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't puff out his chest. He just stood there, immovable, radiating a cold, exhausted violence. They go into the system. They get separated. They get tossed into a group home. Some state worker who doesn't give a damn throws them in a room with kids twice their size. You know exactly what happens to strays in the system, Wyatt. You grew up in it. Wyatt's jaw flexed. A muscle twitched under the harsh ink of his neck tattoo. "That ain't my problem, and it ain't yours." "It became my problem the second I opened that dumpster," Dutch said, closing the distance between them. He lowered his head, locking eyes with the sergeant-at-arms. "I'm not throwing them back into the meat grinder." "You're signing your own death warrant," Wyatt whispered, glancing nervously at the front door. "Clay is going to be here in an hour for church. When the president walks in and sees a makeshift nursery on the pool table, he's going to strip your patch and kick you out into the snow. Or worse." "Let Clay do what he's got to do," Dutch said, turning his back on Wyatt. He picked up the burner phone, popped the cheap plastic back off, snapped the SIM card in half with his thumb, and tossed the pieces into the metal trash can. "Make some toast. The sick one needs solid food." Snow pelted the corrugated steel roof in violent, rhythmic bursts. The compound was waking up. The smell of burning bacon grease and stale cigarette smoke began to mask the lingering scent of iodine. In the corner booth of the kitchenette, the girls sat huddled together. Reno had raided the club's merchandise closet, the only place with clean clothes that hadn't been worn by heavily perspiring felons. The twins were now swimming in black, "Support Your Local 81" t-shirts. The neck holes draped over their shoulders, exposing sharp, protruding collarbones. Dutch sat across from them, a plate of burnt toast and scrambled eggs sitting untouched in the center of the table. The sick girl, still pale, her breathing raspy, stared blankly at the eggs. The awake one was busy tearing a piece of toast into microscopic squares, hoarding them in a small pile near her elbow. "What's your name?" Dutch asked. He didn't use a gentle, coaxing voice. He just asked. He took a drag from a cigarette, blowing the smoke away from the table out of habit. The awake sister stopped tearing the bread. She looked up at him, her dark eyes calculating. She looked at his leather cut draped over the back of the chair, at the brass knuckles resting casually near his coffee mug, at the fresh bite mark turning a deep, ugly purple on his hand. "Cassidy," she croaked. Her voice was harsh, entirely stripped of childlike cadence. It sounded like she had been screaming for days. She pointed a small, dirty finger at her sister. "She's Maya." "Cassidy and Maya," Dutch repeated, committing it to memory. He tapped ash into an empty beer bottle. "Who put you in the trash, Cassidy?" Maya flinched at the word trash, burying her face in her sister's oversized black t-shirt. Cassidy didn't flinch. Her expression went completely dead, a terrifyingly blank mask settling over her 5-year-old features. "Rick," Cassidy said. "He said we cost too much money to feed." Dutch felt a cold, jagged spike of adrenaline hit his bloodstream. It wasn't a flare of anger. It was a quiet, clinical shift in his brain. He filed the name away. Rick. "Where's your mom?" Dutch asked. "Sleeping," Cassidy said flatly. "She sleeps all day. Rick said if we woke her up, he'd lock us in the basement. Then he put us in the truck. He wrote on the box." Dutch stared at the small pile of hoarded toast crumbs. The arithmetic of apathy he usually lived by was completely shattered. He didn't just want to keep them alive anymore. He wanted to find Rick. The heavy oak door at the front of the clubhouse slammed open, shaking the frame. A rush of freezing air swept through the room, carrying a dusting of white snow across the hardwood. Dutch didn't look up immediately. He knew the sound of those boots. Clayton walked in. The club president was a man carved out of granite and bad intentions. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat over his colors, his silver hair pulled back into a tight tail. He moved with a slow, predatory grace, brushing snow from his shoulders. 4 other patched members trailed behind him, laughing about a frozen carburetor. The laughter died the second Clayton saw the kitchenette. He stopped dead in his tracks, his steel-grey eyes locked onto the 2 tiny girls sitting in club merchandise, then shifted to Dutch smoking across the table. The silence in the room became instantly suffocating. Even Reno, massive and imposing, stopped wiping the counter and took a slow step backward. Clayton walked forward, his boots thudding heavily against the floorboards. He stopped at the edge of the booth. He looked down at Cassidy and Maya. Maya whimpered, pressing herself flat against the wall. Cassidy sat up straight, sliding her small pile of toast crumbs closer to her chest, bracing for impact. Clayton didn't say a word to them. He slowly turned his head to look at Dutch. "Dutch!" Clayton's voice was a low rumble, devoid of any discernible emotion. "Why is there a goddamn daycare operating out of my war room?" Dutch took one last drag of his cigarette and stubbed it out on the rim of the empty beer bottle. He didn't stand up. Standing up would be a sign of aggression or submission, and he intended to show neither. "Found them in a dumpster on Route 9 last night," Dutch said, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing a flat tire. "Freezing to death. Someone wrote, 'Nobody wants you' on the box they were shoved in." Clayton stared at Dutch for a long, heavy moment. He looked at the bruised, pale faces of the twins. He looked at the oversized support shirts. "Wyatt called me," Clayton said quietly. "Said you lost your mind. Said you were willing to risk the entire charter over a couple of strays." "Wyatt worries too much about the ATF," Dutch replied, meeting Clayton's gaze without blinking. "They stay, Clay." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. The absolute certainty in Dutch's voice made the other members in the room shift uncomfortably. "You didn't tell the president what was going to happen." Clayton leaned over the table, planting his heavy leather-gloved hands on the wood, bringing his scarred face inches from Dutch's. The smell of cold leather and winter mint tobacco filled the space between them. "You're telling me," Clayton whispered, "that you're going to harbor undocumented minors in a compound that holds illegal firearms, narcotics, and 30 men who would rather shoot a cop than talk to one?" "Yeah," Dutch said. Cassidy, sensing the violence vibrating in the air, suddenly reached across the table. Her small, trembling hand bypassed the toast. She grabbed the sleeve of Dutch's flannel shirt, gripping the fabric with white-knuckled desperation. She didn't look at Clayton. She just held on to Dutch. Clayton looked down at the tiny hand, clutching the arm of his most cynical, violent enforcer. He stared at it for a long time. The harsh lines of his face didn't soften, but something in his eyes shifted, a microscopic fracture in the ice. Clayton stood up straight. He looked at Reno. "Reno!" Clayton barked, his voice echoing off the cinder-block walls. "Yeah, boss," Reno answered quickly. "Go down to the basement," Clayton ordered, not taking his eyes off Dutch. Clear out the storage room next to the armory. Move the crates out. Put 2 cots in there. And someone go to the damn pharmacy and get some children's Tylenol. This place smells like a morgue. Clayton turned on his heel and walked towards the back office, his heavy boots echoing. At the door, he paused and looked back over his shoulder at Dutch. "They're your responsibility, Dutch," Clayton said, the threat clear beneath the words. "They make a mess. You clean it up. They bring the cops. You take the fall." The office door slammed shut. Dutch let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He looked down at his arm. Cassidy slowly released her grip on his flannel, her chest heaving as she retreated to the safety of the corner. Dutch picked up his cold coffee. "Eat your toast, Cassidy," he said quietly. "Nobody is throwing you away today." Frost crept up the edges of the wire mesh windows, sealing the clubhouse in a cocoon of frozen air. Dutch didn't stay in the kitchenette to watch the girls finish their burnt toast. He had a name. It wasn't much, but in a county plagued by meth clinics and rusted-out single-wides, a name was a thread. He intended to pull it until something snapped. Wyatt ran the local databases. The club's reach extended far beyond the chain-link fence of the compound. They owned a quarter of the county dispatchers and had eyes in every narcotic-laced cul-de-sac from here to the state line. Cassidy's flat description of a mother who slept all day, the universal calling card of a heroin nod. And a man named Rick who complained about the cost of food narrowed the grid. By noon, Wyatt slid a greasy piece of torn notepad paper across the scarred wood of the bar. An address, a dilapidated trailer park 20 miles north, hugging the edge of a frozen quarry. Dutch didn't say a word. He folded the paper, slipped it into the front pocket of his jeans, and turned toward the door. He didn't wear his leather cut. He threw a heavy black canvas chore jacket over his thermal shirt and slid a heavy pair of forged brass knuckles into his right pocket. The panhead was useless with its slipping belt, so he grabbed the keys to Reno's battered Chevy Silverado off a hook by the door. The heater in the truck was broken, blasting nothing but dry, freezing air smelling of old fast food wrappers and stale tobacco. Dutch drove in absolute silence. He didn't turn on the radio. His mind was a quiet, clinical void. He wasn't fueled by a blazing, righteous fury. He was driven by a cold, utilitarian necessity. The arithmetic had changed. Rick knew where he dropped the box. If Rick ever felt a twinge of drug-induced guilt and went back to that alley, he might start asking questions. Dutch couldn't leave a loose end breathing. The trailer park was a graveyard of aluminum siding and rotting fiberglass. The air out here tasted like burning plastic and raw sewage. Dutch crunched the Silverado's heavy tires over the icy, potholed gravel, scanning the faded, peeling numbers slapped onto the sides of the sinking homes. Lot 44. Sitting in the weed-choked dirt patch functioning as a driveway was a rusted blue Dodge Ram. A shredded blue tarp flapped violently in the wind, covering a shattered rear window. Dutch killed the engine. He stepped out of the truck, his heavy boots sinking an inch into the frozen, muddy sludge. He didn't bother looking around to see if anyone was watching. In places like this, neighbors learned early to draw their cheap blinds and pretend they were deaf. He walked up the cinder block steps of the trailer. The flimsy aluminum door was dented, the screen ripped half off its track. He didn't knock. He lifted his heavy steel-toed boot and kicked the cheap lock mechanism with the force of a battering ram. The door exploded inward, tearing the frame from the cheap particle board wall with a loud, splintering crack. Dutch stepped into the gloom. The stench hit him like a physical blow, a suffocating mixture of cat urine, stale cigarette smoke, rotting garbage, and the sharp, chemical tang of cooked amphetamines. Trash littered the stained carpet. "What the hell?" a panicked, raspy voice shouted from the back hallway. Rick stumbled out of a dark bedroom. He was bone-thin, wearing nothing but filthy grey sweatpants. His chest was covered in cheap, blown-out tattoos, his eyes wide, pupils pinned into tiny black dots. He held a rusted tire iron in a trembling hand, his jaw grinding frantically. Dutch didn't give him a monologue. He didn't ask for an explanation. He closed the distance in 2 massive strides, his right hand slipping into his jacket pocket. Rick swung the tire iron, a desperate wild arc aimed at Dutch's head. Dutch ducked inside the swing, taking a glancing blow to his left shoulder that sent a sharp spike of pain down his collarbone. He ignored it. His right hand came out of his pocket, the brass knuckles gleaming dull and heavy in the dim light. He drove his fist straight into Rick's sternum. The sound of cartilage snapping was sickeningly loud in the confined space. Rick dropped the tire iron instantly, his mouth opening in a silent, paralyzed scream as all the air violently evacuated his lungs. He crumpled, his knees hitting the stained carpet. Dutch grabbed a fistful of Rick's greasy, unwashed hair and jerked his head back, forcing the man to look up. Blood was already bubbling at the corner of Rick's mouth. "You write a note on a box," Dutch whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. His face inches from Rick's. He could smell the sour decay on the man's breath. "You leave it in an alley." Rick gagged, his hands feebly grabbing at Dutch's thick wrists. "Wait, man, wait. They ain't mine. Her mother is a junkie. She don't even know what day it is. I couldn't feed 'em." Dutch slammed Rick's head backward into the cheap wood paneling of the hallway. The wall buckled. Rick slumped, his eyes rolling back slightly, a thick line of crimson running from his nose over his chapped lips. "I don't care," Dutch said flatly. "I didn't come here for your life story." Dutch crouched down, keeping his knee firmly planted on Rick's thigh to pin him to the floor. He dug his thick fingers into Rick's jawline, squeezing until the man gasped in pain. "Listen to me very carefully, you piece of garbage," Dutch said, the coldness in his eyes absolutely hollow. "You don't have kids anymore. Your junkie girlfriend doesn't have kids anymore. They disappeared. They never existed. If you ever say their names again, if you ever go back to that alley, if I ever catch you breathing the same air as them, I will take a blowtorch to your knees and leave you in the salt flats. Do we understand each other?" Rick frantically nodded, tears cutting clean tracks through the grease on his face. "Yes, God, yes, take 'em. They're dead to me. I swear it." Dutch stared at him for a long, quiet second. He felt a sickening urge to hit him again, to crush the skull of the man who had packed 2 little girls into cardboard like spoiled meat. But he let go. Killing Rick would bring the county sheriffs, and the sheriffs would bring child services. Dutch stood up, wiped a smear of Rick's blood off his brass knuckles onto his canvas jacket, and walked out the shattered door. He left the cold wind howling through the trailer. Night had reclaimed the sky by the time Dutch pulled the Silverado back into the compound. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence over the snow-packed courtyard. He parked the truck, his left shoulder throbbing with a dull, insistent ache from the tire iron. His knuckles were raw, the skin split over his ring finger. He walked into the clubhouse. The main room was empty, the pool table cleared of medical supplies, the heavy industrial heater still humming quietly in the corner. Heavy bass thumped weakly from the jukebox, turned down low for once. Dutch bypassed the bar and headed straight for the heavy steel door in the back hallway that led to the basement. The basement of the compound was a bunker. It smelled of damp earth, motor oil, and the sharp, metallic scent of cosmoline used to pack the club's illegal firearms. But as Dutch pushed open the heavy door to the secondary storage room, A new, entirely alien smell hit his nose. Cheap, artificial strawberry, children's shampoo. Reno and Calvin had done exactly what Clayton ordered. The crates of ammunition and spare Harley parts had been shoved against the far cinder-block wall. In the center of the concrete floor sat two army surplus canvas cots, pushed tightly together. A small, orange-glowing space heater oscillated in the corner, fighting back the subterranean chill. Maya was asleep on the left cot, buried under a mountain of thick grey wool. Her breathing was completely silent now. The dangerous rattle in her chest had vanished, beaten back by Calvin's stolen veterinary antibiotics and the sheer, stubborn resilience of a child. Cassidy was not asleep. She sat cross-legged at the foot of the second cot, still wearing her oversized club t-shirt. She was methodically brushing her wet hair with a cheap black plastic comb Reno must have grabbed from a dollar store. She stopped brushing the second Dutch stepped into the room. Her dark eyes locked onto his. She scanned him with the terrifyingly sharp intuition she possessed. She saw the rip in the shoulder of his canvas jacket. She saw the dried blood smeared across his right hand. Dutch didn't try to hide his hands. He didn't offer a fake, comforting smile. He walked over to an overturned wooden ammunition crate and sat down heavily. His bones ached deep in the marrow. He reached into his left pocket and pulled out two small, plastic-wrapped packages he had picked up from a gas station on the ride back. He tossed them onto the cot next to Cassidy's knee. Two pairs of thick, thermal winter socks, one pink, one grey. "Floor's cold down here," Dutch grunted, leaning his elbows on his knees, wincing slightly as his injured shoulder stretched. Cassidy looked at the socks. She didn't reach for them immediately. She set the plastic comb down on the canvas. She crawled forward to the edge of the cot, closing the distance between them. She reached out her small hand, the same hand that had bitten him down to the meat just 12 hours earlier, and gently pressed her finger against the split, bloody skin on his right knuckle. "Did you find him?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, devoid of the panic or hysteria a 5-year-old should possess when asking about violence. Dutch looked down at her tiny finger resting against his scarred, bruised hand. "Yeah, I found him." "Is he coming back?" "No," Dutch said, his voice a low, solid rumble in the concrete room. "He forgot you exist. Both of them did. They're gone." Cassidy stared at his knuckle for a long moment. Then she pulled her hand back. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. A heavy, almost imperceptible tension seemed to drain out of her narrow shoulders. The feral, cornered animal look in her eyes dulled, replaced by a profound, exhausting wave of fatigue. She picked up the packages of socks, carefully tearing the plastic open. Dutch watched her pull the thick pink socks over her freezing toes. He looked around the room. An armory, a concrete bunker built by men who dealt in violence, extortion, and chaos. It was the furthest thing from a home a child could possibly have. And yet, as Maya shifted in her sleep, burying her face into the clean wool, Dutch knew it was the safest place they had ever been. He had broken every rule he lived by. He had brought immense heat onto the club. He had tied an anchor around his own neck in a life that required absolute, untethered freedom to survive. He was a criminal, a violent man with warrants and a rap sheet. He was completely unequipped for this, but as Cassidy finished pulling the socks on, she didn't retreat to the far side of the cot. She laid down right at the edge, closing her eyes, placing her head inches from Dutch's heavy, steel-toed boot. She was trusting him to guard the door. Dutch let out a slow, heavy breath. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, realized where he was, and shoved them back into his pocket. He leaned back against the cold cinder-block wall, letting his heavy eyelids close. He wasn't a white knight. He was just a biker who opened a dumpster. But as the space heater ticked in the corner, Dutch realized the cold wasn't bothering him anymore. Dutch went looking for trash to throw out, but he found 2 reasons to hold his ground. In a world defined by violence, leather, and gasoline, the Hells Angels compound just became the most dangerous, heavily armed orphanage in the country. Dutch and the twins survived the cold, but keeping them hidden from the law and the system will test every outlaw code the club has. If this raw, gritty story hooked you, hit that like button, drop a comment below on what Dutch should do next, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a brutal, heartfelt chapter.